purpose of this presentation is to provide you with an overview of the second module of the Cville Plans Together zoning rewrite for the City of Charlottesville. What we'll cover today is an overview of Module 2, which is the development standards. My name is Jenny Koch, and I'm a member of the consultant team working for the City of Charlottesville. I'll just be with you for a few minutes, and then you'll hear from my colleague, Christy Dodson, also on the consultant team. This is a continuation of the ongoing community comment period where we're seeking your feedback on the draft zoning ordinance. We're reviewing comments and considering them as they come in, along with your questions. And so we're considering all of those as potential adjustments to the draft zoning ordinance. We're also considering updates to the FAQ based on your questions. We will be sharing a summary of all feedback that we receive, and we'll distribute that when it's available. So please continue to share your comments with us. These are the topics for today's presentation. If you'd like some more background on the zoning rewrite, I suggest you review Module 1 video, which is available at cvilleplans.together.com. There's a link at the bottom of the slide here. But today, we'll walk through an overview of how to participate in this process. You're participating by watching this video, but also we hope you'll continue to participate in other ways. We'll review some information about Module 1, and then we'll go into Module 2, introduce that to you, including how to use the pages and some of the key updates that we are proposing. This graphic is a visual representation of the zoning rewrite process. We're currently in the middle area, the largest section, reviewing the draft zoning ordinance. In the late spring, we expect to start hearings with the Planning Commission and then Council as we move toward adoption of the updated zoning ordinance. Again, before those hearings, we'll be sharing a summary of what we heard now in early 2023, and we'll also be sharing an updated, consolidated draft zoning ordinance. There's a lot of ways that you can learn more and share your feedback. I encourage you to visit the website cvilleplans.together.com if you have not already. We will be holding 2 open houses in April, currently planned for April 12th and April 15th. Those dates are subject to change, but you can find out more information on the website, and we hope to see you there. If not, we hope to hear from you on the feedback form by email or other ways that you would like to share your feedback. Thanks to those who have already submitted your feedback. Like I said, we'll be updating the FAQ to respond to some of the most common questions. We've also made some updates to the website to make things hopefully easier to find on there, especially as we add more information with Module 2.
So we're going to take a little bit of time and talk about some of the things that we're thinking about adjusting for Module 1. I do want to emphasize that the comment period is still open, so we are still welcoming feedback, and we're hoping that you will continue to submit it. But to give you an idea of some of the things that we've heard from Planning Commission and Council, the city staff, as well as the consultant team. And so these are revisions that we're thinking about incorporating in Module 1, and these by no means are the full scope of them, but wanted to give you all an idea. The first is adding an applicability table to the beginning of the chapter, and that really just helps orient everybody to understand, depending on what type of project you're doing, what of the zoning district standards you need to adhere to, whether it's new construction or maybe you're just doing a renovation. And so we want to make sure that everybody understands what rules you need to follow based on the type of project you're doing. Another is, again, for just usability, we want to make sure that we're adding some summary images to the beginning of those zoning categories, as well as some intent language. And that really helps orient everybody to understand what is the purpose of this zoning district category, like residential, and what are some of the images that we're thinking about for the outcomes of this type of development. Another is thinking about flexibility for front and side yards. In the previous iteration, we had said that parking would not be allowed in those front and side yards, and that really doesn't match some of the existing conditions you have. And so we heard that as some feedback that for 1 and 2 unit dwellings, we need to build back in some of that flexibility and re-allow the parking in the front and side yard. Another is thinking about the minimum and maximum setbacks. So that build to zone, to make sure that we provide enough space for the streetscapes, the landscaping, the sidewalk, front yard trees, things like that. So we are calibrating those setbacks and we're thinking about that. Another is clarifying how height is measured. You have a lot of topography in Charlottesville, and so we want to make sure that as we're measuring height, both in stories and feet, that everyone understands how it's actually measured for both of those different metrics. And so we just need to add clarity to that rule section. Again, we are continuing to receive community feedback, and we'll hope that you all continue to submit that. And these, there could be additional changes from that feedback to Module 1. So let's talk about Module 2. What is in the development standards? That is Module 2. You know, in Module 1, just as a refresher, we had the zoning districts themselves, the rules of measurement that really help everyone understand, you know, when we say lot size, what do we mean by that? How do we measure it? That's all in Module 1. That includes the uses as well as the zoning map. So that is what has been submitted previously for public review, and it's been on the website, and we know that you all have been taking the time to review that. So Module 2, this next set of things that are out for the code, that's what we are talking about here today, and that's what's available now. These are the development standards. We'll dig into a bit more what that means, but it is standards for things that go on a site sort of around the development. It talks about things like landscaping, parking, signs, lighting, and we'll dig in a bit more to some of the changes that you can expect to see from how you currently are controlling for some of these things on site to how it's being proposed in the new ordinance. Let's talk a bit about what you can expect to find in Module 2. So this is a visual table of contents that is very similar to the very first page that you'll see when you open up Module 2. I'll talk a bit about each one of these, and some of these we'll dive into in a bit more detail later on in this presentation. The first thing you'll see is what we call a table of applicability. And so this lists all of the development standards down the rows with different project types across the top of that chart. And it helps you understand that as you're looking at different project types, whether it's a new construction or renovation, which of these development standards you need to adhere to in that project. The next thing that you'll find are the development bonuses. And this is really important because it ties into the affordable housing goals of the comprehensive plan, as well as the affordable housing plan that have been adopted. So you will find all of the requirements and standards associated with the existing structure preservation bonus, as well as the affordable dwelling unit requirements and bonus incentives that'll be contained in this section. The next thing that we will talk about are block standards. And so those requirements around how we think about breaking up larger sites into blocks to provide more access for people arriving in cars, people arriving on bikes or on foot, and thinking about building in those good urbanism metrics and those good urbanism standards in the block standards. We'll also talk about multimodal access and parking. This includes streetscapes. So what the requirements are for things like street trees, for sidewalks, whenever the property is sitting on a street or a public right-of-way. This also includes things like how that sidewalk access moves from the public right-of-way to the front door of the property, as well as things like bicycle parking requirements. So thinking about how someone can arrive at a site in a method that is outside of a vehicle. We also include vehicle access and parking. So this is where we think about parking lot design and how that needs to be built and what those standards are that need to be adhered to, as well as parking requirements and transportation demand management. Another aspect of development standards are things like transitions and screening. And so these are transitions for lower density districts and how they transition to higher density districts, and those requirements for things like height transition requirements, as well as landscaping and buffering and screening. So those are all embedded in that transition and screening section. You'll also find standards for things like fences and retaining walls, as well as landscaping. And within landscaping, you'll find standards for things like tree protection, canopy preservation, and planting requirements for ensuring that the canopy in Charlottesville continues to be maintained and is even improved. Environmental sustainability is where you will find your current critical slopes ordinance. And so that's been cleaned up a bit, but fundamentally that is housed in the environmental sustainability portion of the development standards. You'll also see requirements for things like signs, and this is illustrated in a fairly accessible, easy to read, easy to understand fashion. And there are also requirements in the development standards for things like outdoor lighting and making sure that we have good requirements around that. So a bit later on, we're going to dive into a couple of these in a bit more detail, but wanted to give you all a context for what you will find within the module 2, which we're calling the development standards section of the zoning code. I do want to help point everybody to, as a reminder, where are we finding all of this material. It's at the Cville Plans Together website /draft zoning. So you will be able to find both module 1 and module 2 materials available on the website. So I encourage you all to dive into that even deeper. To start off, I do want to orient you all to understand how to use the development standards pages. Something that is important to know is the development standards apply to certain types of projects, different activities, regardless of what district you're in. So we're still going to have requirements for sidewalks and street trees and those types of things, regardless of whether you're in a residential district or maybe you're in the highest density district or somewhere downtown. So these really are standards that apply to everybody. And, we do build in context to it. So it may be a different standard depending on what type of development you're in, but you do still have a standard. We need everybody to read these rules. So it's a bit different from the districts in that regard. And it is a bit weedier. I will give you a bit of a caution there that it gets very technical quite quickly. A part of that is that you will find in the development standards that we are often referencing other documents. So that includes Charlottesville's Standard and Design Manual, and this houses a lot of the engineering standards and the street requirements, stormwater requirements, all of that good stuff. So in the development standards, we are often pointing to the Standards and Design Manual as a companion document. Same thing with the Affordable Dwelling Unit Monitoring and Procedures Manual. So this is a new manual that is being released with Module 2. And this talks about the program management, all the really nuts and bolts details of how the affordable dwelling unit, those development bonuses, how that's managed, how you calculate all of those things. So this is going to be a really key companion document with this zoning ordinance. Streets That Work plan, we talked about that a bit in module 1, and we are referencing it just as much, if not more, in module 2. So again, important companion document. Another piece of this is also some of the documents you have around environmental sustainability. So things like the best management practices for tree preservation, transplanting, removal, and replacement. There's some great construction details in there for how to protect trees during project development. And so we're trying to incorporate those standards into the development standards. And so you will see all of these documents referenced throughout. So I encourage you to know these documents are out there and take a look at those as well and understand how the development standards and the zoning ordinance really link up with these companion documents. The applicability table is going to be the first thing that you see in the development standards, and I've referenced that a bit already. And what this does is it says based on your different project type, you either do or don't have to do certain development standards. And this is right sizing development, and you'll see that in the new construction line, you really have to follow all the standards, right? You're doing new construction, it's a new project, and so we want to make sure that you are bringing everything up to snuff with this ordinance, and we want to make sure that you're meeting all of those standards. But there are different applicability lines highlighted, whether you're an addition or a site modification. Something like a facade modification is, you are sort of reducing in scale the project scope. And so there are less of the development standards that you would have to adhere to. And what this really does is, as you're thinking about doing a project, maybe you are renovating your home, you can go look at that renovation line and sort of go up and down those applicability bubbles and see, okay, this one's filled in, so I need to go read that chapter and understand what my development bonus requirements are, or go down the line and see what my fence and wall requirements are. So it means that for every project, if pretty much everything except for new construction, you can sort of selectively look through the document, and it helps with the usability. So you're not just having to read everything, whether it applies to you or not. You can understand in a snapshot what does and doesn't apply to you. I do also want to orient you to how the standards themselves are organized, and they each have the exact same format. So we start off and we tell you what the intent of the standard is, and this really ties back to the goals of the comprehensive plan. What is the point of this standard? So we tell you that right up front with an intent. The next thing we tell you is when it applies. There are certain standards that apply to certain districts and they may apply differently to other districts. And so we tell you that in the applicability section of that development standard. The next thing that we talk about is the standard itself. What are the requirements that you have to follow in order to fulfill the standard? And that's what we list in the standards. And in most instances, we also include a measurement section. We will often reference things like in Streetscape, for example, we tell you how to measure the width of the sidewalk, for example. And so that really is helping everyone to understand how we measure things, because we all want to be measuring them the same way. So it's a legibility thing. So that's how all of these sections will be organized. And so you can orient yourself to, as you're going through the section, you can say, okay, I can understand why we're doing this, if it applies to me, what it is I need to be doing, and how I need to measure any of these technical aspects. So we're going to dive into some of the, I'll call them hot topics or key updates, things that we know that people are going to be really interested in. So I'm not going to go into detail on every single one of the development standards. We, of course, will be available to answer questions if we don't touch on anything in this presentation, but this presentation, really is a high-level overview. So I'm going to touch on a couple of things at a high level to help orient everybody, particularly some of the key items. The first we know are the development bonuses. This is absolutely essential to tying in and codifying a lot of the goals of the comprehensive plan and the affordable housing plan. And so I do want to continue to remind everybody that what is affordable and what we are thinking about from an affordability requirement. And that really means that housing units where the monthly payments for housing, including utilities, does not exceed 30% of monthly income for someone whose income level is at or below 60% of area median income. So in 2022, last year, 60% of AMI for Charlottesville is $62,900 for a 4-person household. And so that means that your monthly cost for housing, including utilities, should be $1,573 or lower. So that's the definition we're using when we say affordable dwelling units. I do want to orient everybody that there are actually two types of development bonuses that we're talking about. One is the existing structure preservation bonus, and the other is the affordable dwelling unit. And there's an affordable dwelling unit requirement and an affordable dwelling unit bonus. So let's dive into that a bit. First, let's touch on the existing structure preservation bonus. This really is to incentivize the preservation and rehabilitation of existing housing stock. We know that we have a lot of really great existing housing stock in Charlottesville. And it's important that as we continue to add additional housing and add affordability in the city, that we also want to provide some incentive in order to keep some of those existing structures, because it is the sort of look and feel as you walk down the street. So this applies in residential A and residential B zoning districts. And you'll see that we have a little graphic here that shows, here's how you measure that existing structure. And if you preserve this amount of it, then that means you can get that bonus. So in residential A and residential B, you'll see on the district pages that you can have a certain number of dwelling units with a existing structure preservation bonus. And so that's what this means. These are the rules for that. So if that's something that you're interested in or applies to you, then I encourage you to read more into this section on the development bonuses, specifically on the existing structure preservation bonus. The other piece of this is, of course, affordable dwelling units. So we know that this is absolutely critical to the affordable housing goals, the comprehensive plan and the affordable housing plan. And again, I do want to emphasize that there are two pieces of this. There's a requirement that you are required to provide affordable dwelling units, and that applies to any project with 10 or more dwelling units, 10 or more residential dwelling units on any zoning lot in any zoning district except residential A, residential B, or residential C. And so in residential A, residential B, and residential C, we have a different standard. And that is part of the bonus system. And the bonus applies to any project with residential dwelling units. Requirement, do want to emphasize, any project with 10 or more residential dwelling units outside of residential A, B, and C. The bonus applies to any project with residential dwelling units. We'll talk about, there's a bit of a difference in the bonus if you're residential A, B, or C, and if you're a bonus in other districts. So let's talk about that here. So if you're a requirement, so again, I want to emphasize requirement is 10 units or more outside of residential A, B, and C, your requirement is that you have 10% of dwelling units that must be affordable at 60% AMI or less. So that's that definition of affordability we talked about. So 10% of your dwelling units must be affordable at 60% AMI or less, or the developer must pay a fee in lieu so that those units can be built off-site. So those are the ways that you have to meet that required standard. Now let's talk about the bonus. In the bonus, remember I said there's a different standard if you're A, B, and C. So if you're residential A, B, and C, in order to get your bonus units, 100% of the dwelling units of that project must be affordable at 60% AMI or less. So that's how you achieve the bonus, which is an optional bonus in residential A, B, and C. So let's talk about the other districts. So you're outside of A, B, and C, you're in requirement territory. So you have the required, you can go beyond the required and get a bonus. And so how do you do that? In all their districts, if you provide 10% of your units at 50% of AMI, so it's a deeper level of affordability, then you're able to have the density bonus in those other districts. So it's an important distinction of a requirement and the bonus, and it depends on what district you're in. So hopefully that gives you a bit more clarity in understanding that. I do want to, again, point to the standards that are in the zoning ordinance. Those define the term of affordability, the construction requirements for affordable dwelling units. So when you see ADUs, that is a shortening and abbreviation of affordable dwelling units. So we have construction requirements for that, and it also links to that companion document that I referenced early on, the Affordable Dwelling Unit Monitoring and Procedures Manual. How do you calculate AMI? Who calculates it? When does it change annually? How do these get monitored over time? All of that information, which is absolutely critical to this program, is linked in that monitoring procedures manual. So be sure to read the development bonus section and that manual together because they are truly compatible documents. Another key update that I want to point out, and this really only pertains to larger development sites, so think sort of suburban retrofit sites, we are proposing block requirements, and so this means block perimeter as well as block face, those length requirements. It's part of getting that walkable street grid as something moves from a more suburban pattern into something that's more walkable and accessible, getting in those block patterns. So something that we're proposing for really bringing that well-connected network that's convenient both for people on in a car, in a bicycle, walking. We want to make sure that those developments are broken down into sort of gridded streets, so we have some requirements around that. Let's talk about streetscapes. So this is critically important as we think about the walkability of Charlottesville into the future, and this ties into that Streets That Work plan. So we're thinking about the street classification according to the Streets That Work plan, and having the requirements that were in the Streets That Work plan tied to the zoning ordinance. So that's where we get the clear walk zone, which is your sidewalk zone. All of these minimum width requirements, those are from the Streets That Work plan and match that plan, as well as the greenscape zone. So that's that landscape zone that has your street furniture, your street trees, your lights, trash cans, bus stops, all of those good street furniture things that buffer the pedestrians from the street. That exists in your streetscape zone. And again, all of the companion requirements for that are in the Streets That Work plan. So it's really tying the zoning and Streets That Work plan together. Another piece of this that naturally flows from that walkability piece is the multimodal access. So we have requirements for pedestrian access, and really what that means is how does that streetscape tie in with the front door of the building? And so we want to have requirements for how often those have to happen, what the standard for design of that needs to be. So all of that exists in the pedestrian access section. Another piece is bicycle parking. So this is something that Charlottesville currently has in some of its districts, but something that we're adding is differentiating between short-term bike parking, which is your sort of streetscape bike lockup where you have the area where you can park, maybe just beside the front door, or in that greenscape zone, you have the bike locks. Another thing that we're adding though is longer term bike parking. So that's generally housed either within a building or there's a structure that's sheltered, and it is truly bike parking for residents, for office workers, people who may need a bit more security, and particularly as things like e-bikes become more popular, places for people to charge those. something that's out of the weather so that, as you're storing your bike for several hours, it has a bit more security and a bit more protection. So differentiating between that short and long-term bike parking is important to the multimodal access of Charlottesville into the future. Another piece of this is vehicle access and parking. The thing I want to note for motor vehicle access, so this includes a lot, it ties into a lot of different things. It ties into landscaping, it ties into stormwater, and really that is in the parking lot design requirements. And so what kind of trees do you need to have in there? How does it need to filter for stormwater, and making sure that we're not just creating these paved areas that don't think about the environmental aspects of it. So in the motor vehicle access section, we think about things like parking landscape requirements and how that parking lot, if it sits up against the street, how you need to buffer against the sidewalk to make it a more walkable environment. Same thing with parking structure design. We want to make sure that we are sort of tucking those behind buildings, and when they do peek out from behind buildings, that we're screening those so it's a bit more aesthetic, and we're emphasizing the people space and de-emphasizing the car space. Another thing that this section talks about are stacking and loading for things like drive-throughs, and how we can mitigate any impacts into adjacent properties for things like that. So that's housed in this section. The thing I want to highlight in vehicle parking is the current proposal is that we are not requiring any minimum parking anywhere in the city. And so that really is the market-driven approach that a lot of communities have gone to. And it says, the project can sort of provide as much parking as they feel they need in that area. And so that's the current proposal. I will say an important piece of this is large projects over a certain size are required to present a transportation demand management plan, and there are specific requirements in the development standards for that. And it talks about having those developments think about how people are getting to and from the property, if they're providing parking, if they're providing enough, and particularly thinking about alternative modes. So maybe it's building a bit more bike infrastructure, or making sure that bus shelter is well maintained, or maybe it's not a bus shelter today and it needs to be tomorrow for that larger development. So it thinks about all of those things, and that transportation demand management plan is outlined with details in the development standards. So I encourage you all to take a look at that. Another piece of this is transitions, and I mentioned earlier, this is thinking about how development transitions from the lower density districts to the higher density districts. Think of, edges of downtown, edges of between nodes and neighborhoods. How does that development sort of step down and respect the scale when it transitions in scale? And so you'll see that we have a lot of different types of transitions, and they really range in intensity. So if you have in transition A, for example, a 2.5 story building next to something that's more like 5 stories, then the transition is a bit more narrow than transition type C, where it's a 3-story building that's next to something that's more like a 10-story building. And so it thinks about the sort of context of different heights and scales and how they need to respect the transition in that scale. And I do want to point out there are a couple different parts of transitions. So it's not only the height transition that tends to be sort of what these diagrams focus on, but another piece of this is that landscaping buffer that we often call transition screens. And so it really talks about what does that landscaping, that vegetation need to be, how wide does it need to be, what types of plants need to be in there. So that's another piece of the transition. I will say another piece of this section is frontage screens. And so that's when things like parking lots or certain uses maybe that aren't as pedestrian oriented are up against sidewalks. We want to make sure that buffer and that landscaping is specified in those areas as well. So transitions really thinks about both height transitions, but also use transitions. That's really illustrated in transition type D. And so that is thinking about when maybe the buildings themselves are quite similar in scale, but it may be a use that needs a bit more buffering in that particular transition. So I want to make sure that I highlight that there are a couple different component parts to all of these transitions, and that's all detailed in the transition section and talks more about screens and frontages. So think of those as really correlated and working all together. Landscaping is something that I want to highlight. And this is where a lot of your existing tree preservation and replacement requirements, as well as your planting requirements. So those are all being carried forward. And there has been a lot of work done thinking about how that correlates. We are aligning with a lot of your state statutes in this regard. One key improvement that I do want to highlight, because the state of Virginia does fairly tightly control trees and how you can and can't regulate those. So one thing that we are thinking about, because we know enforcement can tend to be an issue, is introducing a tree removal permit for trees over a certain size. And so what that does is it would trigger the enforcement and making sure that as development happens for different districts, and this is all laid out in the development standards, and you can see here on the slide, for residential districts, that you're meeting that canopy cover if you're removing trees over a certain size. We want to make sure that that enforcement mechanism is in place. So that is something that we are introducing and will be an important part of making sure that that tree canopy is preserved. Another piece of this is critical slopes. So I do want to highlight that the critical slopes ordinance that is in zoning today is being carried forward to this ordinance. You will see that there are some language changes, and that truly is for clarifying purposes only. So the requirements themselves, the processes they have to go through, those are all the same today as we are proposing they will be tomorrow. But we updated some things just for clarification so that people understand when it applies, when it doesn't apply, and if it does apply, what are the processes that have to be gone through in order to check these critical slopes areas and make sure that those environmentally sensitive areas are being evaluated properly. So that is all remaining in place. So those are the key updates that I wanted to highlight for everybody. I do want to remind everybody that Module 1 and Module 2 materials are now available on the website, and I encourage you all to dive into those and continue to bring your thoughtful comments. We are looking forward to continuing to have the conversations with you about both Module 1 and Module 2 moving forward. Thank you so much.